Hi everyone, welcome to Sociology 315, Intro to Methods, obviously. I am just a little under the weather today, so instead of offering you my fabulous presence, I offer to you this, this video containing what we would have looked at in class today. So have a look, and I will be back on Wednesday. Thanks. Okay, so what is content analysis? It's rather straightforward. Content analysis is the examination, coding, and coding of documents, text, and media outputs. So basically, you can do an analysis of pretty much any kind of document or text. It can be printed, it can be visual, it can be audio, it can be virtual. And generally, you're looking for, a bunch of different things. Who writes, who's it written by, who is reporting it, what is being reported, where was it written, why was it written, when was it written, and most importantly, maybe what was left out of it, right? So, is it a partial accounting of things? So you can do content analysis both on the quantitative and the qualitative side. Obviously, you're looking for slightly different things in both cases, but we'll talk about that a little bit going forward.
Welcome to another Journey with Chris, where we will obtain new levels of knowledge and awesomeness. Hello scholars, today we're going to journey through unobtrusive research. On our journey we're going to cover content analysis, the process of conducting a content analysis, and the strengths and limitations of content analysis. So what is unobtrusive research? It's research that does not collect data directly from people. So we're not going to interact with people whatsoever. Welcome to another Journey with Chris, where we will obtain new levels of knowledge and awesomeness. Hello scholars, today we're going to journey through unobtrusive research. On our journey we're going to cover content analysis, the process of conducting a content analysis, and the strengths and limitations of content analysis. So what is unobtrusive research? It's research that does not collect data directly from people. So we're not going to interact with people whatsoever. And there's a bunch of different types of unobtrusive research, but for this class we're just going to cover one, and that's content analysis. Content analysis is the study of recorded human communications, such as books, websites, videos, letters, text messages, tweets, and so on. Any type of recorded human communication. Generally, there are two types of content analysis. One is a conceptual analysis, which is what we're going to focus on for this class, and that's analyzing the existence and frequency of concepts within human communication. And the other is relational analysis. That's analyzing the relationship of concepts within that human communication. Okay. In content analysis, there are two types of content that can be analyzed. Manifest content. This is observable content, content that you can actually look at or hear or see, watch. It's right before your eyes, you can actually observe it. And the other is latent content, and that's the underlying meaning of the manifest content. Okay, let's talk about the process of conducting a content analysis. First, we have to have our research questions, and then we need to operationalize our variables. Just as a refresher, to operationalization or to operationalize our variables, it's the process of defining how a variable can be measured. Okay, next we would create a coding scheme. This is definitions of each of our variables and how we're going to code them within the communication that we're going to look at. So for example, let's say that my research question is, what kind of food is advertised during Saturday morning cartoons to children? Because I'm interested to see, I wonder if fast food is the big food that's advertised, or is it sugary soft drinks or sugary breakfast cereal, whatever. Let's do a content analysis and find out. So we need to operationalize our variables. So within the realm of food being advertised, let's define what that is. So within the different types of things that could be shown during those Saturday morning cartoon commercials, we have to define what is fast food. I know that we have it in our head of McDonald's or Taco Bell or whatever, but there could be more of a definition of, well, is Subway fast food or is Pizza Hut fast food? We'll have to define that and determine that. Next, based on those definitions, we are creating a coding scheme. So this is fast food, this is how we're defining it. This is sugary beverages, that's how we're defining it, which could include juice, it could include soda. Let's operationalize, let's define sugary foods. How exactly are we defining this so that we can code it? Next, we want to do sampling. Let's determine how many different kinds of data we want and what time frames we want to collect that data. So for this particular example, for our content analysis, the data is television shows. That's the data we want. We're going to look at television shows, Saturday morning cartoons, for example, for children. And now we want to determine what time frames we want to collect the data, the commercials for food that are shown during those cartoons. Okay, so how long do we want to collect this data? Are we going to look every Saturday morning for a year? Are we going to look at just for a month? What channels should we look at? Maybe we only want to look at 3 different television channels and the shows within those channels. We'll need to determine all of this so that we can sample the data. Next, we want to do coding. So once we've sampled when we're going to collect the data, what channels, and so on and so forth, we're going to look at our coding scheme and we are going to code. So we're going to watch those TV shows. When the commercials come on, we're going to code. We're going to say, is it fast food that's being advertised? Is it sugary soft drinks or sugary cereal? Or maybe it's fruits and veggies, maybe it's milk. Whatever it is, we're just going to code it during that sampling time frame. Then we're going to quantify the codes. So we're doing a conceptual analysis in this example. We're going to look at all the codes we made, and we're going to tally them up. We're going to sum them up and create a summary of what our codes were. And then we get to write about it in our final report. What percent of the commercials were for fast food, what percent were for healthy foods like milk or fruits and veggies, things like that, or sugary soft beverages. And we're just going to give basic descriptive statistics such as summary, averages, what percent were what type of commercial. So the strengths of content analysis is that it's unobtrusive. We're not going and collecting data from people. We're just watching TV, or we're looking through newspapers or certain magazines. Whatever it is related to our research question, we're not dealing with people directly. Another strength of that is that it can be low cost. We don't have to pay people to fill out a survey. We don't have to have several researchers. It's pretty low cost. And this also allows for quantitative and qualitative research. Because a lot of content analysis is looking at certain texts like magazines, newspapers, we can take out whole quotes and do qualitative research as well with content analysis. The limitations of content analysis is that it's time consuming. It can take a long time to figure out our coding scheme, go and collect data and code it for however long that takes. Usually takes quite a while. And there can be coding errors, especially with relational analysis, relating how the different codes relate to each other. And different people might code differently. Also, sometimes when people do content analysis, they may not take into context
Okay, so what are documents, right? Documents can be any source of data that you can read, right? So something that is written down, generally not produced for the purposes of social research, right? So it's not a report or, a statistical something or other. It'd be things like letters, diaries, autobiographies, websites, photographs. So I mean, this wouldn't be for social research because this particular research study wasn't social research so much. But I was just reading the other day about basically a pair of people. One of them is a stats guy, and one of them is a cetacean marine biologist, so studies whales. And basically, they were reproducing what they thought were changing whale behaviors from a bunch of written records from 19th and early 20th century whalers, which I thought was kind of fun and interesting. So basically, they were looking at sperm whales and the changes in sperm whale behavior as people started to hunt them in the Pacific. So I thought that was really interesting, and this all done by logs and diaries of fishermen. This would be a sort of content analysis, right? Obviously, it's not social research because you're studying whales in that case, but that's sort of what you would be doing in terms of content analysis. Now, this can be anything, right? So you could be looking at Twitter posts. So if you remember what, when we watched that clip from the panel I was on Catholic Twitter earlier in the course, that what Haley was doing in that case was content analysis, right? She was looking at people's posts on Twitter. So this is what we call unobtrusive research, right? Basically, you're collecting social data about people without actually having to interact with people at all. You're basically, you don't need to interact with them. You're just kind of letting them run, or looking at the documents that they produce, looking at things that they've left in the world to try and figure out meanings, right? So generally, this could be a lot of things. You could use TV shows, you could use news reports, you could use newspaper articles, you could use all sorts of things. Anything that's written that's not made for social research, diaries, Twitter posts, Facebook posts, anything really. Photographs, all that stuff is all documents. Okay, so Scott's 1990 criteria for assessing the quality of documents. The first kind of category there is authenticity, right? So can you prove that the document is genuine and of unquestionable origin? So, I mean, when you're doing kind of content analysis, right, you want to make sure that particularly, if you're doing something kind of historical where there might be a question about authenticity, you want to make sure that you can prove at the end of the day that the document is authentic, right? So you don't want to get into a situation where potentially you're looking at a forgery or something that whose origin is either unknown or not genuine at the end of the day. Credibility, right? You want it to be free from error or distortion. You want it to be factually accurate, unless, of course, you're sort of studying it to see perspectives and maybe the fact that it is not factually accurate would be part of the study. That would be an exception. Representativeness, right? Is it typical of other things in the same genre? Like, would your diary of a whaler from the 19th century be typical of the diaries whalers kept? Something like that. And the meaning, right, should be clear and comprehensible. Obviously cryptographic or written in code would be bad. Okay, so when we're talking about personal documents, these could be a number of things. So diaries, letters, now I would say emails, text messages, any kind of instant messaging would be, if you can get access to it, would be personal documents. Autobiographies, visual objects like photographs. These are all things that you can study, and people have looked at all of these things. Okay, so if we're looking at Scott's criteria and we're looking at personal documents, so something like diaries, letters, and autobiographies, some of the questions you might want to ask is, did the authenticity, did the author, right, actually write the piece? And so here you might have to do, all sorts of things to establish authentic. Like, okay, so obviously if it's published, say like the diaries of someone like, or the letters of someone like J.R.R. Tolkien, right? So J.R.R. Tolkien, wrote a lot of letters and kept a journal. because adults don't keep diaries, adults keep journals. I'm told. Um, so right, J.R.R. Tolkien kept a lot of letters and diaries and people or journals, and people kept these correspondences, right? So, all of those have been authenticated already. Many of them are published in books, right? You can actually read read the letters of J.R.R. Tolkien and that sort of thing. All right, so you have to establish did the person actually write the piece. If you can't establish it because it's been previously published, right, you might have to look at comparing, say, handwriting or literary style with theirs. Okay, so the credibility is it factual, right? Does it reflect the true feelings of the author? Does it, here, as long as you thought that you were getting like a journal or something like that, you probably wouldn't have to worry too much unless you thought the person was purposely misleading you. So sometimes people do this, like Nabokov, Vladimir Nabokov, the author of Lolita, famously wrote false journals to throw off generations of people afterwards into what his meanings actually were, because Nabokov was like that. I believe Sigmund Freud too, wrote some things in journals that, that were false just to throw people off. But he actually asked for his journals to be destroyed after he died, which I don't actually know that they did. All right. Anyway, representativeness. Do these documents accurately reflect? So if you're doing a collection of a whole bunch of, say, letters or diaries, like if you're doing something like a people's history or a popular history or something, and you were collecting, say, documents about, I don't know, hockey and Canadian history, and you were picking up letters and notes and these sorts of things about hockey, you would want to make sure that it accurately reflected different classes and genders of people. Meanings can be somewhat elusive. This is challenging because, particularly like contemporary content analysis, there's less chance of this. Sometimes meanings change, understandings of things change, so you do have to be careful. And sometimes people just speak in ways, in personal correspondences. People have their own little codes between them or these types of things. People might write in shorthand in diaries or say things that you don't understand within the context of what was going on. So meaning can often be a bit elusive there. Okay, so you can also use photographs in doing content analysis. And, as we kind of talked about, prior to this earlier in the course, photographs can be used to illustrate a point, right? To kind of punctuate your analysis with a particular picture that kind of illustrates what you're talking about as a source of data, right? So you can be talking about things that are visible in the picture or as prompts to get people talking. And Scott basically says there are 3 types of photographs that we can talk about. Those that are, idealization, which is like the formal pose, which I guess would be like family portraits and these kinds of things. The natural portrayal, candid and not posed, and demystification, something that's sort of like, I guess, caught in the moment. It's revealing. It's an atypical portrayal, a snapshot, which is not staged or anything like that. Okay, when we talk about visual objects, right, we do have to worry about representativeness. So photographs that are available, right, might not be typical of an event or an episode depicted, right, because often you have that aspect of reactivity. People clown for the camera, people put particular poses in, or doing certain things in front of cameras that they wouldn't do otherwise. Sometimes, obviously what is not photographed, what official photographers especially leave out can be particularly telling, right? So your official wedding photographs, for example, always show the happy bride and groom and the happy wedding party. It never shows, the bridesmaids drunk out of their mind at the end of the night or anything like that, or the groomsmen, right? You always see, like, sometimes the staged and pretty things in photographs. You don't keep the one where the best man is puking in the corner, like my best man did at my wedding. Okay, selection bias, right? Filtering. Basically what is chosen to be photographed, right? Obviously, photographers and people taking pictures don't take pictures of everything. They try to take pictures of nice things, right? Unless it's a photojournalist, which can happen, but often you're not dealing with a photojournalist. So things can be, not photographed. And then obviously, and especially this is truer in the digital age even than it was in the film age, what you choose to keep, right? Because people will just delete the bad pictures now, and the pictures that might represent the truth of a thing, but not actually be nice looking pictures. So you do have to worry about that when you're talking about visual representations. Okay, so government documents are another source that we often turn to. Official government documents, so census information, voting records, official reports, laws, other kinds of legislation, bylaws, these sorts of things, all are important sources of information. I mean, generally, we tend to think of government documents as being pretty authentic and having meaning, if nothing else, for articulating the position of governments at a particular moment. There is always, a question of bias. Obviously, governments are typically, at least in democracies, and I'm assuming that most of you will be studying democracies rather than, non-democracies, I guess, autocracies in other parts of the world. So at the end of the day, right, governments are in the business of getting reelected, right? So often the official documents that they produce can be aimed in that particular direction, right? So I mean, just think of the Alberta government under the United Conservative Party, as maybe a possible example of this. Fundamentally, they might produce, say, a report attacking a Netflix cartoon show. And I mean, is that authentic? Yes, definitely. Does it reveal a bias? It certainly does, right? It reveals a certain, something about what they want to portray, right? That Netflix and Hollywood are bad and attacking the oil industry. That definitely tells us something about the moment that document was produced, right? So it reveals a bias. It reveals a lot of information, and you want to pay attention to stuff like that. I mean, there's a lot of other things that potentially bias or that documents can reveal in terms of particularly interesting information, right? Like laws can represent, or even legal findings, court decisions can represent all sorts of interesting things about particular moments, about what was held as precedent, what was seen as important, what were key social values at that particular moment, right? You can go and kind of work through a lot of this and figure stuff out. And you can do this in lots of different ways, right? Like you can do it just in terms of like looking at how often certain words are repeated, say in legal documents in cases involving XYZ at a particular period. And that would be a kind of a way to do it, if something was being challenged in the courts. Or, the frequency of which certain cases were filed. You could also look at, there's other ways that you could use those kinds of documents as well. You could actually look at the content and what the decisions were and what they reveal about certain kinds of understandings and bias at the time. And there's all sorts of this kind of research, right? From, people looking into doing almost like social anthropology into, say, the Stasi, the East German secret police during the Cold War, right? When they opened up their archives and you could just go and see whatever documents they had produced, this generated a certain kind of information, right? A certain kind of thing that was potentially interesting, and that you can see, what they were saying about their own citizens, what that revealed about, say, the biases, right? And it was always in favor of the state and in favor of how this person could, be harming communism. That's more Russian than German, I think. And the same thing with the Mitrokhin archives of the KGB. Obviously, people have gone into the Vatican secret archives, which are no longer called the Vatican secret archives. They changed the name, but the secret archives sounded cooler. And find out kind of what the church was thinking, what at particular moments, what it revealed, about the state of the world and how they understood their place in it at the time. There's lots you can find from, say, official documents. Okay, so obviously another source that you can get documents from is from private sources. Now, private source data can be really hard to get. And so, I mean, unless you have some, unless a company's like defunct, or they give you access to their documents or someone leaks them, I can't, it's not very often, I think, that you would see anything other than, say, maybe like a white paper from, from a private organization. I suppose it could happen. It's just not super common. I mean, you could get like PR documents, right? I certainly looked at some PR documents when I was talking about television stations in Russia, right? Like press releases and other like corporate statements and these things. Now, I mean, I generally didn't find those terribly useful because they were all for promotional purposes, and they told you some things, but not a ton. Okay, but let's say like things that are documents produced by companies or private organizations. Generally, they're authentic and meaningful. They can tell us a lot. Credibility, right? You may have bias based on, if it's promotional material. Obviously, you have a company attempting to make itself look really good at the end of the day, so you can't necessarily trust that. You know, so that might be next to useless. And often, like, you can have situations where the data is very biased, where it's based, where it's meant to sort of forward a corporate agenda. Sometimes maybe shield the CEO from having too much information, or these kinds of things. So you can think of a lot of the stuff that say was produced by the cigarette companies, by companies like, I think, Procter and Gamble was a big cigarette producer. A lot of their internal documents that only really came out when they had to do discovery in legal proceedings. And they had to turn over internal documents, basically proving they knew about the damage tobacco was doing to people. So I mean, some of that, obviously, there was spin in it too. Is biased in favor of, making sure that this information didn't get out, or that, the harms of, say, cigarettes were downplayed. And you can see a lot of distortions within corporate data. Now, that said, you can seriously work through a lot of that and sort of identify the bias, and then, you don't have to be led by it. You can correct it at the end of the day. But yeah, I mean, for the most part, unless you get lucky, when someone leaks something to you, and then there might be ethics involved in using leaked documents unless they're widely leaked, right? Because you're not a journalist. But if something was leaked and then published, you might have access to it. If WikiLeaks maybe leaked something, even there, I think maybe the ethics of using a leaked corporate document, it's complicated. Now, here's interestingly, you wouldn't necessarily have to run that by an ethics like an ethics review board or a research ethics board, because you're not dealing with human subjects. But you might open yourself up to legal liability for using a leaked document, so you might want to be careful on that. Now, that said, nobody reads academic literature anyway, so it might not be a big deal. I mean, if corporations do let you in, right, there's a real question of whether they're going to potentially guide you through to the data that they want you to see. So there's that. Or sometimes the other process is what's called a document dump, right? They'll just give you everything, but this could be tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of documents, and then it's your job as the researcher to work through them. And that could, it becomes an insurmountable task. This is why law firms, when they do discovery, have, big staffs of associates often. And why, when it comes to like big class action lawsuits against, tobacco companies, oil companies, pharmaceutical companies, or whatever, often it's only the biggest law firms, from New York, Chicago, and LA that'll take on those kinds of cases, because that they're going to dump documents on you in discovery, right? They're going to just pile you down with tens or hundreds of thousands or even millions of documents, and then you have to hunt through to find anything meaningful. And it's a legal strategy that works. Companies can do this to you too as a researcher, and it could be by just carelessness. They don't want to curate, so they just give you everything, and then you have reams of corporate data, reams of it, to the point of absurdity. Okay, let's go with that. Okay, so when you get news, mass media outputs, newspaper, magazines, TV, film, authenticity can be a little tricky because it can be hard to know who you're dealing with, right? So this may or may not be a problem. Not every article is bylined, right? So you may not know who wrote it. Generally there you can just, attribute it to a publication. Sometimes the problem with a lot of things is then you get into multiple authorships, right? You get, with especially with TV and film, multiple people are writers, so you don't know what came from which voice. Broadly speaking, I don't think this is a huge issue. Sometimes you'll get this, where unbylined news articles, you can just cite the newspaper generally, and I don't think that's actually a big problem. Credibility, right? Sometimes there's errors or distortion in the representations that can skew things that are going on, and that may give you a distorted picture. And I mean, your job as a researcher is to pick that out, right? To try and figure out where the distortions might be, where there's PR spin or ideology going on. It depends on the publication, right? So generally, it's good to stick to high quality publications, things like the Times, LA Times, New York Times, Washington Post, Globe and Mail, National Post, these sorts of, Maclean's, The Atlantic, these sorts of things. You get better, but there's obviously like minor sources. If you're doing, say, a look at the LGBTQ community, you might want to look at Pink News, which is an LGBTQ news site, which again, then you do have to, that there's an ideological kind of slant in that coverage for sure. Or if you say we're, wanting to talk about, media polarization, you could look at, say, MSNBC and Daily Wire or Fox News. But again, you'd have to kind of balance where the ideologies of those different news sources maybe distort, what their objective was in doing the coverage that they were doing. So, when we talk about, those news sources, they're also representative of certain voices, right? You would say, like, again, if you were looking at let's say you're looking at a certain issue. I'm just trying to think of one that could be interesting. Let's say religious freedoms, like representations of religious freedom, right? You might want to take a look at, the way that this is articulated in different political positions. So you might take a look at something like Daily Wire or something like Fox News or National Review, right? These kind of right-wing sources, and then look at equivalent kind of left-wing sources to try and understand, but always understand that each of these represents a certain constituency and that they speak to that constituency directly, right? That MSNBC speaks to the left, Fox News speaks to the right, Politico speaks principally to the left, Daily Wire speaks principally to the right. All of these sorts of things, right? You want to keep that kind of in mind at the end of the day. And then the context is important, right? Are you looking at an editorial? Are you looking at straight news? Are you looking at a culture piece, right? Are you looking at humor, satire, whatever, right? You wouldn't want to take something like The Onion and treat that in the same way as you would the New York Times, right? You wouldn't want to take the Babylon Bee and treat that in the same way as you would National Review, right? Even though, they both, Babylon Bee and National Review are both kind of right-wing sources. The Babylon Bee is humor, right? Is satire. Same thing with the right or the left, sorry. Say you would have MSNBC or the Toronto Star, say, on the political left, and then The Onion also on the political left, but one is satire and one is straight news. You want to keep that in mind as well. Right. So virtual sources or online sources, right? Emails, websites, listservs, discussion groups, chat rooms, etc. So there's lots of issues with these things, obviously, and I think you can kind of understand. You can certainly use them as evidence, right? Like if you wanted to talk about conspiracy theories, right? You could go on Reddit, that hive of scum, villainy, and, people trying to push their OnlyFans sites. So, that Reddit being a hive of scum and villainy, you could find lots of things, I'm sure, on QAnon or on, Stop the Steal or whatever, vaccine hoaxes or whatever you want. And you could use that as an interesting kind of source of information as to what's circulating in the world, right? Now, of course, you have to worry about the quality of what you're getting. You'd have to worry about, obviously information taken from websites. You'd have to take them, if you're taking information for the purposes of making claims about, veracity, you have to obviously look at the quality of the site that you're looking at the end of the day, right? You wouldn't want to take necessarily something from, say, Daily Wire as a piece of straight news, right? You can look at it as opinion news or like right-wing news, but you want to take it as a piece of straight news. The same with, I would say, like something like the Toronto Star, right, which is very, very left-wing. You wouldn't necessarily, I think, want to take it as a straight mainstream source of news. You'd want to stick to something like the Globe, or the National Post, or something like that, which are more kind of center right and center left. Websites, anyone can set up a website. So knowledge claims are hard to check. It's hard to check authorship in a lot of cases, right? When you're talking about emails, listservs, discussion groups, right, chat rooms, Reddit, whatever, people can make up usernames. People have multiple accounts, people comment on their own stuff. It's not always truthful what's going on there. Same thing with Twitter. Potentially people make up fake accounts all the time. Credibility, right, is a gong show online. But then I think you would probably want to use online in slightly different ways depending on the content, right? And here you would want to separate out, news websites, right? And I've used news websites a lot, and I tend to treat those as authentic and credible versus just a general purpose website broadly, or a YouTube video, right? Or or a Facebook post or whatever. We treat those in different ways based on what they are. Okay, so is the stuff you're finding representative, or did you find the fringe example that proves your point? You do have to worry about that when you're using virtual sources. It's constantly changing too, so tracking things down later on can be hard. Citing it can be hard. And the churn of information can be a bit overwhelming. And yeah, bias exists in the selection of news sites and all sorts of sites online. You have to be aware of that. Like I was saying, right? Daily Wire and Fox are going to post different things than HuffPo and Vox, right? They're all gonna have different sorts of takes on things. And yeah, so what's the context of the website you're dealing with? That's obviously important. And then when you're dealing with forums and things, there's going to be language barriers, slang terms. So you have to be able to explain those things. The textbook calls it web speak, which I think is adorably old-fashioned. I've never heard that term, or I haven't in 10 years, and I'm a media scholar by trade. So among other things, was one of my trades, I suppose, media and religion scholar by trade. So there is that. So yeah, web speak is a dumb word. Don't use it ever. People will look at you like you're crazy. But even simple things like upvote, downvote, right? That's a thing that's kind of specific to Reddit, more or less. Right, so you want to understand those things and make sure that all those things are understandable to you before you delve into it too deeply. Okay, so broadly speaking, when you're talking about content analysis, you can analyze things in essentially kind of three major categories. So words. So typically you're talking about the frequency of words or the frequency of pairings of words. So here, there's actually been some really interesting research done. Particularly, say, on media and the kind of emphasis that media puts on certain things. So one of the things that I saw recently was that someone was doing an analysis of the New York Times and the Washington Post, and basically looking at the frequency of the times they use, language around social justice, right? Questions of social justice around race, around, things like equity, reparations, these sorts of things that have come up frequently. And what this basically showed is that if you look at the Times, and you can do this using a system called LexisNexis, and basically what you see is that this basically starts around 2009, right? There's it was sort of flat in terms of these racial justice dialogues, 2009, and then it spikes upward, and it's been kind of flying upward at an exponential rate ever since then. So people have done this type of analysis with kind of, content analysis. You could look at pairings as well, so you could look at race politics, right? You could look at pretty much any pairing you could think of. They have the examples here: feminist, spirituality, race politics, rave, drugs. You could look at race police, race justice, race crime. Anything that you can kind of imagine, you could kind of pair together and look at the prevalence of them together. So subjects and themes, right? This includes, kind of things that are right out there, or things that, are kind of in the subtext, potentially. So, you could be looking for just simple kind of themes in stories, women in politics or, race and crime as sort of thematic. But you could also be looking at, things like whether gender stereotypes are invoked or implied, right? How do they talk about women? How do they talk about, say, African Americans in media coverage? Is it overwhelmingly positive? Is it overwhelmingly negative? Does it follow certain patterns? Do we see potentially race always, I say African Americans always being linked to discourses around crime or drugs or deviance in some way, or are they frequently being tied to stories about racism, right, and experiencing racism? You could look at those kinds of thematic trends in media and see where, say, something's being covered in a particular way or people are talking about it in particular ways, and whether this has shifted over time. I think is always an interesting kind of way of going about it. And then value positions, the way that certain, terms are surrounded often by judgments, either a positive or a negative judgment around a lot of things. So what is the presentation of, say, something like multiculturalism or race or, gender or, I don't know, like conservatism or liberalism or all of these things, right? You could look at any kind of general subject that you want to look at. Religion, right? You could do one about religion, and I think you could look at how is it presented, say, in media discourses. Is religion presented, as a good thing for society? Is it presented as ultimately regressive and bad for society and outdated or whatever, right? You could look at all of these sorts of things to find out sort of what's going on at a meta level in a lot of cases. Okay, so coding. Coding is basically the process of attempting to put into mostly quantitative terms things that are found in content analysis, right? In terms of content. So basically, there are two major concerns when we're talking about coding. One is designing a coding schedule. And basically, this is, the form where you're going to be recording the particular data that you find when you're doing the coding. And then designing the coding manual, which is the set of instructions to coders, lists what is to be coded, the categories and where kind of different kinds of statements would fall into those. The numbers, so the actual codes, right? So again, you can put this into quantitative terms to each category, and kind of general guidance for coders, like how are you going to do this? Okay, so this is what your coding manual might well look like. So here, obviously, we're talking about stories about crime. So here you would have, for each case, so each story that you looked at, you would code the following, right? The type, the nature of the offense, right? So if it was a violent offense, you would get a code of 01. If it's a sexual offense, 02, robbery, 03, and on and on. The gender of the suspect, right? Male, female, or unknown. You'd probably have more in there now. Occupation of the suspect. So, this would be how you would basically code the person, what they do for a living, if the story mentions it. The recorded age of the suspect, right? If it's unknown, it's a -1. And if it's, any other age, you put in their actual age by number. Gender of the suspect, male, female, unknown. Occupation of the victim, you have the same list here, so you would go with the same thing. If not applicable, you code as 99. Age of the victim, again, same thing. Depiction of the victim, are they victim responsible for the crime, victim partly responsible for crime, not at all responsible, or not applicable, like if there's no statement made about it, and on, right? So, and then like, where is it in the news? Front page, inside, back page, if you were dealing with, obviously, a physical newspaper in terms of layout. You might not see this now. Web page, you would probably have to design a different kind of scale for it. But nonetheless, this is kind of what a code book would look like, or a coding manual, rather. Okay, so what are some of the potential problems you can run into when putting together a coding scheme? So, okay, for one, the categories have to be mutually exclusive. So this is somewhat similar to the idea that when you're writing a survey, you can't have double-barreled questions, right? That you can't be asking about two things. If your categories when you're creating a coding scheme have some overlap, it may be unclear to the person who is coding your data, if you're not doing it yourself, into which category you might be putting things, right? Or which category they should be putting things into. So obviously, right, if you're coding this kind of data, you need to have a good sense that your categories don't overlap, or it's just going to be confusing. Now, to an extent, I don't know that, at the level that we are talking about, that this is going to be a huge problem. Chances are that, at the master's and the PhD level, unless you're involved in a really big research project, say with a supervisor, I would say good chance that you're not going to be having anyone do your coding for you. If you're lucky enough to do this kind of research, you're probably going to be doing your coding yourself. So you can kind of clean this up as you go, and it's not that huge a problem for most of you. But it is something to keep in mind, right? If you go on to be professional researchers in some capacity, either academically or not, that you do need to kind of keep this in mind. Okay, the next one is that categories have to be exhaustive, right? You really need your categories to encompass pretty much everything, like every kind of idea, every kind of theme that might be present in, say, the content that you're analyzing, right? If you're analyzing news articles, you want it to be exhaustive of the subject you're looking at. So, of course, this can be difficult, right? Because you can have a huge range of things that are discussed. You can potentially miss things. Again, probably not a huge big deal when you're developing your kind of first research project as a grad student or whatever, because chances are you're going to be doing your own coding, so you can fix your code book as you go. But once you get to the point where you're sort of passing this off to, say, a grad student of yours, someone who is going to be doing work for you, this could become a bigger problem, right? And this is where your code book will have to be, or your coding scheme will have to be really, really clear at the end of the day. So along with that, right, your instructions for coding have to be really clear, because obviously unclear coding schemes and unclear coding instructions are going to lead, especially if you have more than one person doing coding, to different people making different choices. So let's say you have two different people doing coding and you have an unclear instruction. One person might choose to interpret it one way, the other person a different way, and you'll end up with people coding different, say, news articles out of the Edmonton Journal about, teenage crime in different ways. And then what you get is a pile of useless data that needs to be gone over and fixed, because at least half of that data is then going to have to be merged with the other half and probably recoded, and you're going to end up with, something that's essentially utterly useless. And then you need a clear unit of analysis, right? So basically, whatever it is that you're analyzing, right? If you're analyzing newspaper articles, you need to distinguish that you're looking at the content of newspaper articles rather than maybe, the larger problem that you're trying to look at, right? So if you're looking at, how religion is framed in news articles, that's what you'd be looking at, right? News articles and how they frame religion, rather than the problem that you're analyzing, say, like the growth of secularism in Canada. And you wouldn't want to confuse those two, because again, that's going to make your data gobbledygookly. Okay, so like with a lot of things in this course, pilot testing your coding will actually help a lot, right? So to do this, right, if you had people doing the coding for you, or you and someone else were doing the coding, take your code book, take a sample of a couple of news articles that you would be looking at, and each of you code it, and then look at where, possibly you were together and where you potentially had differences, and you'll basically find, where the problems were. Because what you need at the end of the day, right, is intercoder reliability, right? So that multiple people who are coding the same thing are going to come up with the same results. And intracoder reliability, right? So basically, one person is always coding things in the same way. You can't have, and this, there's lots of reasons that you might have trouble with this, that you might actually have, a person, as you get more tired, you start coding things differently. So you want to make sure to try and balance that out so you're not getting too much variation, because obviously that will, hurt your validity and your reliability at the end of the day if things aren't being coded well. Okay, so qualitative content analysis. And here they have it listed under content analysis without a pre-existing scheme. And this is basically, to be honest, what I am most familiar with and sort of most comfortable with is not this kind of quantitative way of like putting things in little boxes and giving them a number, which to be honest, I find dreadfully boring, but I understand the value of it as well. Qualitative content analysis basically is, I would say, a little qualitative content analysis is a little bit less kind of rigorous in terms of the way it kind of writes things down, but tends to be, you're looking for underlying themes present in whatever your unit of analysis is. So you basically decide, for yourself what the themes that you're kind of extracting are going to be, and how the presence of that theme would be established. Themes, would be recurrent topics mentioned in texts or in recordings. They could be, just about anything. Okay, so I'll kind of break this down for you in terms of my own experience and how I did this. And this was, I would say, incredibly crude. Because when I was doing my research project, right, I put together my research proposal to my supervisor and then my candidacy committee, and my supervisor took a look at it, and she was like, "You're not actually going to do this," because what I had proposed was very much a kind of quantitative type of research where I would be like, yeah, putting things in boxes, being like 1, 2, 3, this is a da 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 da. And she said, "Are you going to sit there through hours of interviewing and do this?" And that was my intention at the time. And she said, basically, "That's going to take you forever. Why don't you do it a different way?" And so what I ended up doing was basically what I did with my interviews, which, because I had conducted them all myself, was not too difficult to do, because I sort of remembered what people had said and I could go through and find it in the transcripts. But basically, I generated transcripts. As I've said, I cheated because I'm a cheater. I'm okay to own that. And I sort of went through, and as I went through them kind of over and over again, reading through them, I created sort of categories. So, this one was about television in Russia in the early 2000s, right? Early 2000s. What were production sets like? And so I took all of the comments from production sets and kind of copied and pasted them into a Word document where I'd like list the person's name who said it and all of the comments they made on, set design or production spaces or whatever it happened to be. Throw all of that stuff in there. Attitudes from, local producers about consultants all into one category. And I just kind of copied and pasted them there. And then when I was writing through, and we'll talk about writing up your research later, but as I was writing it up, I'd be like, okay, now I'm talking about this aspect of what I learned in the interviews. So I'm going to take all of these things and I'm going to look through that category, pick out the quotes that make the most sense, maybe paraphrase a few other ones, and kind of run from there, or make blanket statements like, "Many producers told me that XYZ," and that was kind of where I went with that. So I think hopefully what you can get from my description of my much less rigorous and much less kind of scientific way of coding that data was that it was much more instinctive, much more kind of qualitative, right? It was about people's experiences and much more about putting those general experiences into categories without necessarily giving those categories a numerical value or trying to put them into a spreadsheet and be like, the poor quality of production spaces was mentioned in 87% of the interview, and that, or it was mentioned 87 times, like that kind of thing. So that would be, I think, what qualitative coding often looks like, is sort of trying to put things into broad categories. Now, I mean, I don't think I did mine especially, because it was for my own use and nobody else had to get inside of it. It was just my brain, and my brain functions the way it does. I could code it and put it together in a way that made perfect sense to me. And I mean, I had my friend Dorothy look at it and she's like, "What in the actual H is this?" She's like, "How do you make sense of any of this?" And for me, it made perfect sense. I was like, but the way she coded her qualitative data for her dissertation project, I was like, yep, nope, this won't work for me. I have no idea what's going on in any of this. It's a little bit less rigorous. Hers was way more rigorous than mine, to be honest. But being trained in evaluation, that's kind of more what they do there than sociology, and particularly sociology of media. So that was, I think, where some of that differed. So there's lots of ways of doing this. There's lots of different kind of ways of doing it. And I think as a researcher, especially if you're the only one needing the data, you can code it sort of however you want, as long as it's there for records if you need to look at it or if someone else needs to look at it later. Okay, so Al-Tedi does talk about a different form of content analysis inside the qualitative space called ethnographic content analysis. And here, I'm going to be perfectly honest, this is one that I am not particularly familiar with. So we'll just go over the basics here. Basically, apparently differs from quantitative analysis in that the researcher is constantly revising themes or categories as the data is examined. I actually don't think that's true, but whatever. Learn it for textbooky purposes. It emphasizes the context in which documents were generated. Sure. We'll say that. It emphasizes the context in which documents were generated. All right, fair enough. It talks about where these things came from. And then it's recursive and reflexive between the development of data, collecting data, coding data, sampling data, and the analysis. So you're kind of doing a back forth, and you'll revise, your sampling, your collecting and coding as you analyze the data and realize certain things. I tend to think this is all content analysis at the end of the day, but okay, we'll go with whatever this is. All right, so semiotics is one of the ways that potentially we can analyze content. So semiotics is a particular school of thought. It originates in France and kind of the post-war era. But at the end of the day, it has been used pretty widely. I don't see a lot of semiotics analysis right now, but we'll talk about it a little bit. So semiotics is supposed to be the science of signs, right? The study of signs and symbols as a science like any other. And looks at systems of communication and meaning by looking at signs. And what is a sign? It's the blend of the signifier, so the word or the symbol that signifies something, and the signified, the actual thing, and that together forms a sign, right? So in this example, the signified is a dog, that particular dog. The signifier is the word dog, and together those make up the sign, right? So what you think of as dog in this particular case, you see that dog, you think, oh, there's a dog. That's the sign that you're using to represent the dog in your own mind. I mean, semiotics is supposed to, try to find the hidden meaning in texts. The sign is something that, stands for something else. The yellow traffic light stands for yield, right? Or the stop sign stands for stop, or all sorts of things. And it gets, of course, more complicated than that. Okay, so here's another kind of set of categories that you can use to analyze media text. Visual text in particular, though you can use it for all sorts of things. So these come from Roland Barthes, who is a French, kind of structuralist thinker who talked a lot about media. And he basically said that any kind of media text functions at 3 levels, right? So 3 levels of meaning in any media text. So at the the most obvious level, right? The one that's right in front of your eyes all the time, you see denotation, right? The most immediate level of meaning, a picture of a face denotes a specific person. Oops, I hit my mic stand there. I'm swinging my arms like a crazy person because even though there's no one in the room, I still am a crazy person. Okay, connotation is the next level of meaning, and basically connotation is a little bit more abstract, concepts that are invoked by, a particular representation. So if you see, a picture of a beautiful woman on a fashion magazine, she might represent the concepts of femininity, sexiness, the ideal female body, depending on what it is, right? Empowerment, it could be a lot of things, right? And then myth. Now this is the one that almost always trips people up, and it's really, really hard to sort of get at. But it is the broad set of cultural assumptions and beliefs that are evoked and reinforced by a media text. Okay, so I know this seems very abstract. We're going to take a look at a couple of things here, and I'm going to sort of walk you through how I would do this. denotation, connotation, and myth. Okay, so this is the actual image that Barthes uses to talk about these concepts, right? This is the cover of a magazine called Paris Match, which I think is defunct now, but he was writing about, and it had this, almost like a Boy Scout in some kind of French, children's organization somewhere in Africa. And basically he says that, what you see here at the level of denotation is, a kid in a uniform saluting, right? Pretty straightforward. A kid, African kid in a uniform saluting. At the level of connotation, what does it kind of connote? It connotes discipline, it connotes pride, right? It connotes order, it connotes patriotism, right? Because he's got the salute and the uniform. So there's all these things that are sort of, associate meanings with it. That's the level of connotation. And then at the level of myth, what Barthes says is that this image broadly, at the level of myth, evokes the glory of the French kind of empire, right? The French nation and all of the wonderful things that it's doing for all of its African colonies. Because at the time, France still had colonies in Africa. And so it's like, this is, at the level of myth, it's reinforcing the belief in people who are French that their country is beautiful and that its presence out in the world is bettering the lives of people all over the place, particularly, this in Africa, where most of its colonies were. Okay, so this is another one. This is an ad for some kind of Mitsubishi SUV. I actually don't know which one. Okay, and I can't make it out from the text. I just pulled this off of Google image search a few years ago. And here, right, what do you see, right? You see, wheels, a rhinoceros, a chassis, a kind of grayish background. Okay, so what's the connotations here? Like, I think if you look at the rhinoceros and the colors, you think of like ruggedness, toughness, reliability, I would say even, the concept of kind of masculinity at the end of the day, right? That, this rhino, it's a tough animal, it's a strong animal, so it's got all of those kind of connotations. Okay, all that's actually pretty easy, I think. At the level of myth, all right, and this is not a definitive reading of this ad in particular, right? There's a million different possible readings that you could have of this in terms of the connotations. And at one point, Barthes sort of realizes that that's a problem too. Okay, but at the level of myth, what does this, I think, sort of represent? And here, hopefully you can follow my thinking. I think this ad sort of represents sort of the rugged individualism of kind of Western culture, right? That basically at the end of the day, what this ad is appealing to is this idea that, if you buy a Mitsubishi car, you can go anywhere you want, you can do anything you want, your car is going to be super tough and reliable, and so you're sort of free to do whatever you want, to go on adventures, to be an individual who just roams about as they wish. And again, like, that's not a definitive reading, that's just what strikes me, right? It's a rugged individualism. All right, so the same thing with this little ad. We'll do the same kind of activity here. Okay, so what do I see here? Obviously, you're in a kind of dark room. I'm guessing like a seedy-ish motel, right? Poor lighting. You've got, a hole in the roof, a lady, skimpy dress, angel wings, and in the corner, at the level of denotation, the words axe, excite, even angels will fall. Okay, so what's connoted here, right? You've got sex, right? The connotation is sex. The big connotation is sex, right? That axe and sex are somehow connected to each other. Right, so you've got axe and sex. You've got, I think, an idea of kind of masculinity. That there is something, a connection to masculinity. There's definitely a connotation that I think a certain kind of kind of femininity is sexy, one that is kind of skimpily dressed. I think there is a bit of a connotation here too, based on the color schemes, that there's something sort of, illicit about sex, and particularly about, say, how to put this politely for a CHRTC class, about engaging sexually with a creature that is pure, right? An angel is supposed to be like a pure spiritual being, and clearly the implication, even angels will fall, is that this angel is about to be deflowered by someone wearing Axe body spray, which I find unlikely given who I know who wears Axe body spray. Okay, so what functions here at the level of myth? I think there's a lot going on in this ad. I think it's surprisingly dense for what's there, which is why even just kind of looking at it, I'm struggling a bit with it. I think there is a kind of implication here at the level of myth that masculinity is about sort of conquest, and particularly about a conquest of females that are seen as pure, right? That there is a sort of like deflowering the virgin sort of vibe to this, and that is sort of what masculinity implies, that it is sort of bringing the good girl, if you will, to the seedy side. They've brought the angel into the seedy motel where clearly she's about to sleep with a guy wearing Axe body spray, which, like I said, seems unlikely to me. And so there's a whole message about, both that is what masculinity is, and that's the most desirable kind of masculinity, which is a sort of conquest of the pure female kind of masculinity. And it sort of reinforces that, right? Like you can see what Barthes means in a sense when he talks about myth, both sort of embodying and then reinforcing this idea. There is this idea that, he, as like a male, a red-blooded, American male or Western male, it is your purpose to, get it on with a pure, preferably probably virginal, female. And so, again, I'm not saying anything about that is right, but that does, to me, that's where this functions at the level of myth. And, you could say, in a sense, like this is a sort of a reinforcement of what you might call toxic masculinity. So hermeneutics is another possible interpretive framework that we can talk about when we talk about texts. Hermeneutics originally was used principally for talking about the Bible, right? It is principally a method of biblical analysis, and basically what it is trying to, sometimes also you could refer to hermeneutics as like the historical critical method, which is kind of a sub-method of hermeneutics. The thing that the authors of the textbook are sort of referring to as hermeneutics is what's more properly in biblical studies called the historical critical method. Basically, what you look at is the meaning of the text by looking at the author's circumstance and when, like in which context the text was put together, right? So if you're doing this with the Bible, you would say that, I don't know, the Gospel of Matthew was written around the year 70, and in 70, right, you've got Nero as the emperor of Rome. Christianity is trying to spread out, and so Matthew will emphasize certain themes having to do with trying to recruit Romans, and I don't know, I'm just making that stuff up. That's not actually, I think, the proper hermeneutics. But then you would say like, okay, and this is why Matthew or whoever wrote the Gospel of Matthew wrote this and this and this and this and this, right? And this is what this means in the context, and in this historical period, this is how they would have understood what he's saying here, and blah blah blah. Right, and so you would look at the author's worldview, how that contributes to the meaning, and basically context here is the critical thing for understanding a particular text, and that's hermeneutics. Like you could move this forward, right? You could do this with newspaper articles. Like if you're looking at a newspaper article from 1930, you could look at the context, who the person was, their class, the kind of language they're using, so who they're writing for, and all of these things, and you could then attempt to reconstruct like what's going on around the text to get at the meaning of what's going on.